Recognize Ms. Greene from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're hearing a lot about funding from Democrats today as we're preparing our budget here in the House of Representatives. And I'd just like to point out, we don't have a revenue problem in Washington, we have a spending problem. And there was a lot of misuse of COVID funds during these shutdowns and a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's why we're here on the Oversight Committee today. I also wear another hat other than a congresswoman. I'm a mother. And I have 3 children, and I have children in school, or at least one of them has graduated. The other 2 are now in college. But my youngest, my son, he's graduated in the class of 2022. Now, thankfully, I'm from a red state where his high school opened up quickly. His activities resumed, but my 3 children did suffer during that time. All 3 of them lost their part-time jobs. My daughter, who was a D1 athlete in college, her sport was completely suspended for an entire season. They lost many things, but I will say that thankfully, because our schools reopened quickly, my son's education did not fall behind. But many's education did fall behind. We've talked about ACT scores. For example, approximately 42% of the graduate test takers from the high school class of 22 failed to meet the benchmark scores in English, reading, science, and math. The average of that class was 19.8 out of 36 on the ACT. This is a failure and a direct result of school closures. I'd also like to talk about, I hear a lot from my colleagues on the other side talking about vulnerable children and children in poverty and children that are at risk, especially with learning disabilities. That's something else I know about. Children with autism, Down syndrome, and other disorders, they went without their therapies, tutoring, and many other things that they were used to receiving when they were in person in education and schools. That was detrimental. I have a family from my district whose daughter with autism completely quit speaking after years and years of therapy that she had finally begun to speak, and she quit speaking again when her therapies were discontinued. I think that's a complete failure. But the most devastating effect that I think that we all saw was the suicide increase in children. It's unthinkable to me that any child would commit suicide, and I know all of you on the panel agree with that. But here we saw suicide increase to 6,000 suicides among the ages 10 to 24, 51% increase in suicide attempts in girls ages 12 to 17. But boys were the ones that so tragically were actually getting the job done with the largest rate of suicide in an average of 8% increase. And so it's just completely devastating. But another thing I'd like to point out that we haven't really talked about here is the gigantic impact on mental health of our kids while they were being forced to stay home, many of them alone by themselves, sitting in front of a screen for most of their waking hours as they were trying to educate themselves with online learning, which was a failure for many. But they were also spending their time on TikTok and Instagram, which are 2 poison pills for our children's minds. And since this time, these school closures, we've seen a dramatic increase in trans-identifying children, which is something that was not normal nor common many years before this, and I think that's completely devastating. But I'd also like to point out how the AFT, the teachers union, with the teachers that, by the way, were getting paid to stay home and didn't have to go to work, were the ones talking to the CDC about when should schools reopen. And then we had governors of blue states. So I'd like to ask each of you, and each of you take your turn, if you had the chance to explain with your experience and knowledge that you have about the horrific failures of the COVID shutdowns, what would you say to Randy Weingarten, who I would prefer to be on this panel today? I think that's who we should be talking to. Or what would you say to CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, who I also think we should be questioning today? Mr. Zywig, if you had questions for her, what would you ask? And then I'd like to hear from each witness. Thank you.
I would ask Dr. Walensky why the evidence that existed in front of us, real-world observational evidence, was dismissed or ignored and instead we focused on projections and models about what would happen. That is against sort of fundamentals in the hierarchy of evidence when you look at, and we chose to look at a lower form of evidence and prioritize that over real-world evidence that was occurring. And I'd like to understand why that happened.
Thank you. Dr. Hug?
Yeah, so I would like to discuss with Randy Weingarten about the perceived risks both to teachers and children, as I do think that there was a misunderstanding and a miscalculation about the many risks that children face and about the risks that teachers faced also from children. But I would like to ask Dr. Walensky, why, when she was creating the guidance for reopening the schools in February of 2021, that she was using the wording of the teachers' unions in terms of requiring 6 feet of distance and not actually consulting the scientists and physicians who were doing the actual research, looking at amount of distancing and transmission in schools, and why it seemed like the teachers' unions had a more dominant voice in creating those guidelines than the scientists did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Gentles?
Yeah, I think that if I had the opportunity to speak with Randy Weingarten, I'd ask her about what her conversations are like with teachers in urban districts that were closed and did not serve students. What is it like to talk to teachers in Baltimore at schools that have 0% students proficient, 0? Mm-hmm. And what is it like to talk to teachers in Newark that have less than 2% of their students proficient in math? What is she advising those teachers now when they say, what do we do? How do we teach these kids? How do we turn this around? She has to take responsibility for keeping those schools closed and creating the situation for her members, for her teachers. What is she going to tell them to do now?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Ms. Mazik?
I would speak from a public health perspective from the federal, state, and local level and ask for a way to communicate lessons learned. After action plans are very common in dealing with emergencies. I think that needs to happen on all levels so that we know what to do the next time we have a pandemic.
Thank you very much. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. A lot of this has already been said, but I'm going to state it anyways because I do think it's important. But early on,